6 months ago. Nobody knew my grandfather's name. Then the HOA painted a sign on my dock. Community property, no trespassing. It read, "My own pond." The whole street gasped when I didn't argue. I just smiled and made a phone call. Somewhere across the neighborhood, a woman's hands started shaking. She had no idea what was coming for her. My name is Daniel Cross, 42 years old, a structural engineer who works from a converted garage office so I can keep an eye on my 2 kids after school. My wife Rachel teaches 3rd grade. We bought our house in Whispering Pines Estates 6 years ago, drawn less by the cul-de-sac than by the quarter-acre pond behind it. That pond wasn't part of the subdivision's amenities. It came with a separate deed my grandfather signed in 1962, decades before Whispering Pines existed as anything but pasture. To me, it was a legacy, a place where my kids learned to fish, where Rachel and I ate dinner on summer evenings, undisturbed. Whispering Pines had an HOA like every development built after 1995. And for years it stayed background noise, landscaping fees, holiday light rules, the occasional notice about trash cans left out too long.
Ipaid Malasia duas.
Mowed on schedule, and never gave the board a second thought. That changed when Denise Bellwether won the HOA presidency in a special election nobody remembered voting in. She arrived with a laminated binder, a 5-year vision plan, and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Neighbors said she'd sold real estate for 20 years and knew how to charm a room. At the first meeting I attended, Denise talked about unlocking hidden community value. She used the phrase 4 times. I didn't think much of it until she mentioned, almost as an aside, that several undeveloped water features in the neighborhood could become shared recreational amenities to boost everyone's resale price. I raised my hand and said my pond wasn't part of the HOA's common areas. Denise smiled without looking directly at me. "We'll have our attorney review the old plats," she said sweetly. "Sometimes original developer paperwork gets messy." The room chuckled. I didn't laugh. Rachel warned me not to let it bother me. "She probably says that to everyone," she said, rinsing dishes while our kids argued over homework. But I'd built houses for a living long enough to know that when someone mentions reviewing paperwork unprompted, they've usually already decided what they want to find. 2 weeks later, a WPE community newsletter arrived. Buried on page 3 was a paragraph about restoring public access to the community's natural water features for the enjoyment of all residents. My name wasn't mentioned, but the aerial photo circled my pond in red marker. I called the HOA management office. A tired-sounding woman named Carol told me Denise had requested county plat maps from the 1980s. Conveniently the decade the subdivision was platted, conveniently ignoring that my parcel predated the subdivision by over 20 years. "She's very thorough," Carol said, with something like an apology in her voice. At the next street barbecue, my neighbor Tom Alvarez pulled me aside. He'd lived in Whispering Pines since it broke ground and remembered when the original developer, a man named Walt Bellwether, ran into money trouble in the late 90s. "Bellwether," I repeated. "Any relation to Denise?" Tom just raised his eyebrows. It turned out Denise had married into the Bellwether name 19 years ago, Walt's nephew. She'd moved into the neighborhood only 3 years back, bought a foreclosure 2 streets over, and immediately started attending every HOA meeting like she had something to prove, or something to finish. I didn't say anything to Rachel about Walt Bellwether yet. Felt like nothing, a coincidence of last names. But the seed was planted. And something told me this wasn't really about shared recreational amenities at all. It was about something older, something buried in paperwork nobody had looked at in decades. The first official letter came on HOA letterhead, addressed to property owner, a title that felt deliberately impersonal given Denise knew exactly who I was. The cited Article 4, Section 2 of the Covenants, claiming all natural water bodies within platted boundaries, belong to the Association for Community Use. I read it twice at the kitchen table while my daughter did homework beside me. The letter demanded I remove my unauthorized dock structure within 30 days or face daily fines. I laughed out loud, which made my daughter look up, worried. "It's nothing, sweetheart," I told her. It wasn't nothing. I called our real estate attorney, an old college friend named Priya Nair, and read her the letter over speakerphone. She went quiet for a moment. "Do you have your original deed?" she asked. "It's in a filing cabinet somewhere," I said. "Find it," she replied. "Tonight, if you can." That night I dug through a fireproof box in the garage until I found a yellowed folder labeled Cross Family Property, Pond Parcel.
Inside was the original 1962 deed. My grandfather's signature faded but legible, and a surveyor's plat showing the pond as a separate, privately owned parcel entirely.
Rachel sat beside me on the garage floor as I read through it. "This predates the subdivision by 33 years, I said. "There's no way the HOA covenant can claim it." Rachel squeezed my hand. "Then why does she seem so sure of herself?" I didn't have an answer yet. The next morning I photographed every page and emailed them to Priya. She called back within the hour, her voice careful. "This is solid, Daniel. But before we send anything, let's see what she actually files. People like this sometimes back down quietly when they realize you're organized. Sometimes they don't." I decided to wait. But strategy, Priya's advice was to let Denise commit to a position in writing before revealing what I had. "The more she puts on paper," Priya said, "the more rope she gives us." I didn't yet understand how much rope that would turn out to be. A week passed in uneasy quiet. Then a second letter arrived. This one announcing an emergency board resolution, scheduling a vote to formally designate my pond, and two others in the neighborhood as HOA common areas for the safety and enjoyment of all residents, effective the following month. I noticed the other two water features belonged to elderly residents, the Whitfields, both in their 80s, and a widow named Grace Okafor who'd buried her husband there the year before, his ashes scattered along the reeds. Denise wasn't just after me. She was after anyone too tired to fight back. That detail changed something in me. This wasn't a paperwork dispute anymore. It was a pattern, and patterns meant intention. I started keeping a folder of my own, every letter, every newsletter mention, every date, because if Denise Bellwether wanted a fight built on documentation, I intended to out-document her. The small conflict ignited at the next general HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse under fluorescent lights that made everyone look exhausted before anyone had said a word. Denise stood at the podium in a blazer the color of a stop sign, binder open, ready to present her resolution. "Tonight," she began, "we vote to reclaim what rightfully belongs to this community." She clicked through slides of my pond, the Whitfield's pond, and Grace's pond, labeled underutilized community assets. She never used our names. She called us certain residents resistant to shared prosperity. I stood up before she finished. With respect, Denise, 3 of those 4 parcels have deeds predating this HOA's existence. Mine included. The room murmured. Denise's smile flickered, just for a second, like a light bulb about to die, before she recovered it with practiced ease. The board's attorney is reviewing all documentation, she said smoothly. Until then, the resolution simply authorizes access planning. Nothing is being seized tonight. It was a technicality, and a clever one, vague enough to pass, specific enough to open the door for everything that came after. Grace Okafor spoke next, her voice trembling but firm. My husband's ashes are in that water. I don't care what any binder says. The room went silent. Denise's face didn't change. She simply said, "The board understands this is emotional," and called for the vote anyway. Passed 7-2, mostly because half the board members were people Denise had personally recruited over the past year, filling vacancies with friends from her real estate office and a cousin who'd moved in specifically, turned out later, to be eligible to run. Walking out to the parking lot, Tom Alvarez caught up with me. "You saw that vote count," he said quietly. "That's not a board." I asked how long he thought she'd been planning this. Tom shrugged. "Isn't improvised. It's rehearsed." I called Priya that night and told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Daniel, I want you to start recording every meeting from now on, openly, with notice given. Not for a lawsuit yet. For a paper trail nobody can later claim doesn't exist." The following week, a small orange flag appeared at the edge of my dock, a surveyor's marker, though I'd hired no surveyor. When I called the county, the clerk said an HOA commission survey had been filed requesting a boundary reassessment of disputed common area parcels in Whispering Pines. I drove to the county register of deeds office myself the next morning. The clerk, patient woman named Ms. Delgado, pulled the original 1962 filing without hesitation. "This parcel's never been part of any HOA plat," she said, tapping the page. "I don't know what survey they're talking about." She printed me a certified copy on the spot, still warm from the machine, and I held it like it was made of gold. It was the first concrete proof, official and undeniable, that the pond had never belonged to anyone but my family. I almost laughed with relief in the parking lot, but relief didn't last. That evening, Rachel found a note taped to our mailbox, and signed, typed rather than handwritten. "Some people think they're above community rules. We'll see about that." No name. No return address. Rachel double-checked the locks before bed. I photographed the note and added it to my folder, now growing thick enough to need its own binder, an unintentional mirror of Denise's own presentation style. Priya told me not to confront Denise directly about the note. "We don't have proof it's her. Save it." 2 days later, my homeowners association account showed a new fine, $400 for an unauthorized dock structure obstructing designated common area access, backdated to the day of the vote, as though the resolution had already been finalized rather than merely authorizing planning. I called the management company, and Carol, sounding more tired than ever, admitted Denise had personally submitted the fine outside the normal review process. "She has emergency authority for safety issues," Carol explained, though nobody could tell me what safety issue a private, fenced pond posed to anyone. That week I noticed unfamiliar footprints along the pond's edge, and a section of my chain link fence bent outward, as if someone had tried to slip through rather than around. My security camera, cheap and motion-triggered, caught only a blurred figure at 2 a.m., too dark to identify. I filed a police report anyway. The officer who came by was sympathetic but non-committal. No clear evidence. No clear crime yet. Just a strange feeling and a bent fence. "Keep documenting," he told me, echoing Priya's advice almost word for word, as though everyone already sensed where this was heading. Grace Okafor called me the same week, her voice tight with fear rather than grief now. Someone had left a courtesy notice on her door threatening to drain her pond for mosquito abatement unless she signed a form granting the HOA formal access rights. She hadn't slept in days. I told her not to sign anything and drove over with printed copies of my deed research, showing her how to request her own county records. She wept a little at her kitchen table, not from sadness this time, but from the relief of realizing she wasn't facing this alone. That night I understood the shape of what Denise Bellwether was really building. Not a park, not a shared amenity, but a slow, procedural land grab dressed up in community spirit language, aimed at whichever residents seemed too old, too tired, or too polite to push back. I wasn't going to be one of them. The first layer of real escalation began with certified mail, a formal notice of lien threatening to place a legal claim on my home over unpaid HOA fines. The same fines Denise had invented from a resolution that hadn't actually finalized anything. Priya called it premature and almost certainly unenforceable, but it still felt like a punch. I brought the notice to a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes, recommended by Priya, a sharp, unshakable woman named Renata Ibarra. She read it once, snorted, and said, "This is aggressive for a board president with no legal authority over deeded property outside the HOA's platted boundary. She's bluffing hard." Renata drafted a response letter citing the 1962 deed, the certified county records, and Article 4's actual language, which, when read in full rather than selectively quoted, explicitly excluded parcels conveyed prior to subdivision platting. Denise, had either not read her own covenants closely, or hoped no one else would. We sent the letter certified, with return receipt, timed deliberately before the next board meeting so there could be no claim of surprise. Renata warned me Denise might not back down even with clear proof. "People like this don't retreat from facts," she said. "They pivot to a new narrative." She was right. Denise didn't mention the deed at all. Instead, she pivoted to safety concerns, claiming my pond's unfenced western edge posed a drowning hazard to neighborhood children, despite it being fully fenced on every side, a detail she apparently hoped no one would check. A young mother named Priscilla Lang, new to the board, actually raised her hand to correct Denise, saying she walked her dog past that fence daily and it was intact. Denise's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps recently repaired," she said. An accusation with no evidence, delivered as though it were established fact. After the meeting, Priscilla approached me in the parking lot, glancing over her shoulder like she was checking who might see. "Something's off with her," Priscilla whispered. She had me look through old board minutes last month for anything about water access. "I think she's building a story, not finding one." I asked Priscilla if she'd be willing to share those old minutes. She hesitated, clearly torn between board loyalty and something that troubled her more. "Give me some time," she said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And in a fight like this, uncertainty from the other side felt like progress. Meanwhile, fines kept appearing on my account. 500 for obstructed emergency access, 300 for unregistered water feature signage, charges invented faster than Renata could formally dispute them. I started keeping a spreadsheet, dates and amounts, watching the pattern of harassment take numerical, undeniable shape. Rachel began to worry more visibly, not about the money, since Renata assured us the fines were unenforceable without a real lien process, but about the atmosphere settling over our home. Our daughter asked why the mean HOA lady kept sending letters. Explaining injustice to an 8-year-old is harder than any legal filing. I tried keeping the kids shielded from most of it, but the neighborhood itself made that difficult. Denise had started a private Facebook group, Whispering Pines United, where she posted vague warnings about residents blocking community progress for personal gain, with a photo of my dock, my name never mentioned but obviously implied. Comments piled up beneath the post, some supportive of Denise, most simply confused. A few neighbors defending me by name once they recognized the dock. The digital pylon felt worse somehow than the certified letters, public, permanent, searchable by anyone considering buying a house on our street. Tom Alvarez, of all people, became my quiet ally in that fight, posting calm corrections with links to publicly available deed records whenever Denise's group grew too heated. He never argued loudly, just dropped facts and let them sit, which seemed to frustrate Denise more than any confrontation could have. One evening Tom knocked on my door holding an old cardboard box. "Cleaning out my garage," he said. "Found this." Inside were newsletters from the HOA's earliest years, back when Walt Bellwether still sat on the founding board before his financial troubles forced him out entirely. Buried in a 1998 newsletter was a short paragraph mentioning a dispute over several private water parcels excluded from the original platting agreement.
Due to prior ownership, an almost word-for-word echo of my situation now, decades earlier, under a different bellwether, on the same contested land.
I photographed every page and sent them to Renata, who called almost immediately, her voice sharpened with interest rather than alarm. "This isn't a coincidence," she said. "If Walt tried this before and failed, Denise might be finishing something he started. That changes the shape of this case considerably." I asked Renata what she meant. "Motive," she said simply. "Fraud cases live and die on motive. If we can show this isn't really about community amenities but about a family grudge or a family debt, it stops being a paperwork dispute and starts being something a prosecutor might actually care about." That night I couldn't sleep, turning the pieces over Walt's failed land grab, Denise's marriage into the family, her sudden arrival in the neighborhood 3 years ago, her immediate, aggressive rise to HOA president. None of it felt accidental anymore. It felt like a plan finally being executed by someone patient enough to finish it. The next HOA newsletter escalated things further, announcing a community vision fundraiser to install a public dock, fishing pier, and picnic area at the newly reclaimed water features, complete with an artist's rendering that used my actual dock's shape and dimensions, clearly traced from a drone photo taken without my permission. Seeing my own property redrawn as public infrastructure, my kid's swing set edited out of the image entirely, sent a cold jolt through me unlike any fine or letter had. This wasn't administrative anymore. It was a woman already spending imaginary money on land she didn't own, certain she'd win before the fight had even truly started. I brought the newsletter to Renata, who added it to the growing file, now thick enough to require its own accordion folder. "She's getting ahead of herself," Renata said. "Confidence like this either means she has something we don't know about, or she genuinely believes her own story. Either way, we need more proof." Grace Okafor's situation grew worse that same week. A contractor arrived unannounced at her property with equipment for authorized drainage work, citing HOA paperwork she'd never signed. Grace, shaking, called me before calling the police, and I drove over immediately. Renata's number already dialed on speakerphone in my car. The contractor, a young man clearly hired through a middleman and unaware of the dispute, showed us a work order signed D. Bellweth, HOA president, with no owner authorization attached at all. Renata, listening in, told him plainly over the phone that proceeding without owner consent would expose him to personal liability. He packed up his equipment within 20 minutes, apologetic, saying he'd been told the paperwork was all handled. Grace sat on her porch steps afterward, staring at the pond that held her husband's memory, and said quietly, "She almost drained him away because of some form nobody asked me to sign." That moment hardened something in me. This had stopped being about property lines. It was about a woman willing to disturb a grieving widow's most sacred private space for the sake of a fabricated community project. Whatever Denise Bellwether wanted, she was willing to hurt real people quietly to get it. Priscilla Lang finally messaged me that weekend. A single photograph attached, a page from board archives showing Denise had requested, months before I ever received my first letter, a full title search on all pre-1995 parcels within HOA-adjacent boundaries, specifically listing my address, the Whitfields, and Grace's. The date stamped on the request was nearly 8 months earlier, long before Denise had ever mentioned community water features publicly. Whatever she was building, she'd been building it in silence for the better part of a year, waiting for the right moment to make her move look spontaneous. I asked Priscilla why she was finally willing to share this. She said she'd joined the board hoping to help modernize the community, not to watch an elderly widow's private grief become a line item in someone's expansion plan. "I didn't sign up for this," she wrote. "I don't think most of us did." Renata called it the first real thread of premeditation, something a court would weigh heavily against any claim that Denise's actions were simply overzealous community stewardship. "This shows intent," she said. "Intent changes everything. Now we need to find out why she wanted these specific parcels so badly, so early." That question, why these parcels, why now, sat with me for days, until an offhand comment from Carol at the management office cracked it wide open. "Funny," Carol mentioned during an unrelated call. "Denise asked me last spring about the appraisal impact of waterfront access on resale values." Waterfront access. Resale values. For a few weeks, things went strangely quiet. No new letters. No new fines. No new posts in the Facebook group. Rachel allowed herself a cautious exhale, suggesting maybe Denise had realized she was outmatched. I wasn't so sure. Silence from someone like her usually meant regrouping, not surrender. I used the lull to keep researching quietly on my own, cross-referencing county tax records with real estate listings. I discovered Denise held a real estate license under her maiden name, Denise Faro, and had personally listed 3 homes in Whispering Pines over the past 2 years, each advertised heavily around future waterfront potential. One listing, sold just 4 months earlier, explicitly promised buyers planned community pond access coming soon in its marketing description, months before any resolution had passed, months before most residents even knew a plan existed. It wasn't community vision. It was a sales pitch she was writing checks against with land that wasn't hers. I sent the listings to Renata, who read them twice before responding. "This is it," she said. "This is the motive we needed. She's not fighting for the neighborhood. She's inflating property values around parcels she doesn't own, using her own listings to profit personally from a fraudulent claim of shared ownership." Rachel, reading the printouts over my shoulder, shook her head slowly. "She's selling the idea of your pond before she even owns it," she said. "That's not ambition. That's just theft with better marketing." I laughed despite myself. The first real laugh I'd had in weeks. Tension finally finding somewhere to go. During the quiet weeks, Grace Okafor invited me over for tea, wanting to thank me properly for stopping the contractor. Sitting in her small kitchen, she told me stories about her late husband, about the pond, about how Whispering Pines used to feel like a real community before Denise's binder culture took over. "You remind me of him," Grace said suddenly, catching me off guard. "He never raised his voice either. Just kept quiet, kept records, and eventually people like her run out of road." I didn't know what to say, so I just squeezed her hand, grateful for a kind of validation no lawyer could offer. The Whitfields, the elderly couple facing the same claims, finally agreed to meet with Renata after weeks of hesitation, their daughter driving in from out of state to help them navigate the paperwork. Their deed, dated 1971, held the same protective language mine did. Another parcel Denise's plan had quietly targeted. Renata began preparing what she called a consolidated response, combining all 3 affected families into a single coordinated legal position rather than 3 isolated disputes. "There's strength in numbers," she explained.
"It's harder to dismiss 3 families with matching
I started attending informal gatherings at Tom's house, where affected neighbors compared notes over coffee, building an unofficial timeline that mirrored, and increasingly exceeded, the documentation Denise herself had once wielded so confidently. The tables, quietly and steadily, had begun to turn without anyone announcing it publicly yet. The lull broke the night I received a call from an unknown number. A man's voice, hesitant, identifying himself only as someone who used to work with Denise's family. He said he had information about the original 1998 dispute and Walt Bellwether's financial collapse, but he was scared to say more over the phone. We agreed to meet at a diner 2 towns over, away from Whispering Pines entirely. Rachel worried about me going alone, but Renata insisted on tagging along under the pretense of a business meeting, sitting 2 booths away with a clear line of sight, just in case the meeting turned into something else. The man's name was Gerald Finch, a retired accountant who'd handled bookkeeping for Walt Bellwether's original development company back in the 90s. He explained, hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug, that Walt had tried to quietly absorb several private water parcels into the HOA's common areas to boost overall subdivision valuation before a planned sale. The plan collapsed, Gerald said, when the original owners, including my grandfather, refused to sign quitclaim deeds despite pressure and, in a few cases, outright forged paperwork that never made it past the Register of Deeds. Walt lost the subdivision anyway, sold his remaining stake, and the family blamed the stubborn old owners for decades. Denise married into that story, Gerald said. I think she sees this as unfinished business. Family pride. Maybe. Or she found out somewhere along the way that finishing what Walt started could make her a very wealthy woman. Given what waterfront lots go for now. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were old internal memos, and signed but clearly from Walt's company, discussing alternative acquisition strategies for the disputed parcels, including one chilling line: if deed challenges fail, community pressure and procedural fines may eventually force voluntary surrender. It was almost word for word the playbook Denise was now running. Gerald admitted he'd kept the folder out of guilt for decades, having typed some of those memos himself under Walt's direction, never confronting what they implied, until whispers reached him recently that a bellwether was president of the very HOA built on that same contested land, running the same old plan under new letterhead. Renata photographed every page at the table before we left, careful not to remove originals from Gerald's possession without proper chain of custody. This is generational fraud, she said quietly in the parking lot afterward. Not overzealous community spirit. A calculated continuation of a scheme her husband's family started 30 years ago and never abandoned. Driving home, I felt something shift from anger into something colder and more focused: determination. This wasn't just about protecting my pond anymore. It was about ending, once and for all, a slow-moving injustice that had already outlived one generation and was trying, quietly, to survive into another. I told Rachel everything that night, laying the folder's photographed pages across our dining table like evidence at a trial neither of us had asked to be part of. She studied Gerald's old memo for a long time before speaking. She's not improvising, Rachel finally said.
She's finishing her family.
The second wave of escalation arrived almost immediately, as though Denise sensed the ground shifting beneath her even without knowing exactly why. A new notice appeared, announcing an emergency assessment of $500 per household, ostensibly to fund legal defense of community common areas against what she called obstructive resident litigation. The vague, ominous phrasing worried neighbors who had nothing to do with the pond dispute at all, and several confused residents cornered me at the mailbox, asking what exactly I'd done to cost everyone money. I explained calmly, showing my deed on my phone, watching confusion slowly curdle into quiet outrage on their faces. Denise had, apparently without realizing it, begun turning her own neighbors against her simply by asking them to fund a fight most of them hadn't known existed until the invoice arrived. Community sentiment, once vaguely sympathetic to shared amenities, began souring the moment it touched people's actual wallets rather than abstract ideals. At the next meeting, attendance tripled. Folding chairs lined the clubhouse walls. Residents who'd never bothered attending before now filling every seat, drawn by curiosity, confusion, or the $500 charge sitting unexplained on their statements. Denise, for the first time, looked visibly rattled by the size of the crowd. She opened with practiced calm, discussing necessary legal preparations, but the questions came fast and pointed. "What lawsuit?" someone shouted. "Nobody's suing anyone," I called back, standing so the room could see me. "There's no litigation." There's just 3 families with legitimate deeds she's been trying to pressure into giving up their land. Denise's composure cracked slightly, a flush rising in her cheeks. That's not accurate, she said, though she offered nothing to actually contradict it. Priscilla Lang, sitting on the board dais, glanced at me, then back at Denise, visibly weighing whether tonight was the night she stopped staying quiet. A resident named Harold Kim, retired military, stood and asked flatly for an itemized breakdown of what the previous fines and assessments had actually funded. Denise deflected, citing attorney-client privilege, a claim Renata later confirmed was legally meaningless for an HOA board discussing its own budget with its own dues-paying members. The meeting ended without a vote, Denise adjourning early, citing the late hour, though it was barely 8:30. Walking to the parking lot, I overheard clusters of neighbors comparing notes, several mentioning they intended to request formal financial records, a request Denise clearly hadn't anticipated when she began this campaign. 2 days later, my home's exterior camera caught something unmistakable this time. A woman in a familiar blazer color standing at the edge of my property line near dusk, photographing my dock and fence from multiple angles before quickly leaving when a passing car's headlights swept across the yard. The footage was grainy, but her build, her walk, her clothing all matched Denise closely enough that Renata immediately flagged it as significant. Even if we can't prove identity beyond doubt in court, she said, this establishes a pattern of personal surveillance that supports a harassment claim independent of the property dispute itself. I filed an updated police report attaching the footage. The officer this time seemed more engaged, noting the growing paper trail of fines, threats, and now apparent surveillance. This is escalating, he said plainly. If anything else happens, call immediately, day or night. This is starting to look like a real pattern. Grace Okafor's house was targeted next, more brazenly. Someone left a dead potted plant on her porch with a note reading, "Some things just need to be removed for everyone's good." An ambiguous, unsettling message that could have referred to the plant, the pond, or something far more menacing depending on interpretation. Grace, badly shaken, finally agreed to install security cameras of her own, something she'd resisted for years, feeling it made her small house feel like a fortress rather than a home. "I never thought I'd need protection from my own neighbors," she told me over the phone, her voice thinner than usual. Renata compiled everything, the note, the camera footage, the fines, Gerald's old memos, Priscilla's leaked documents, into a formal complaint filed with the county's HOA Regulatory Division, alongside a separate harassment report naming Denise specifically, though carefully worded to avoid outright accusation without stronger proof of the surveillance footage's identity. Word of the filing spread quickly through the neighborhood's grapevine, faster than any official notice ever could. Denise's Facebook group, once actively moderated with quick deletions of dissenting comments, grew chaotic, filled with residents demanding answers, some defending her loyally, others openly questioning her motives for the first time. In a strange twist, Denise posted a lengthy statement claiming she was the victim of a coordinated smear campaign by residents unwilling to embrace positive change, framing herself as the wronged party despite the mounting evidence otherwise. The comments beneath it split sharply, no longer the unanimous support she once commanded. A local news blog covering suburban disputes picked up a watered-down version of the story after an anonymous tip, likely from someone in the neighborhood Facebook group. The headline was vague: HOA dispute over private pond divides North Carolina neighborhood. but it added a layer of public visibility Denise clearly hadn't wanted. She called an emergency board meeting to address misleading media coverage, but only 4 of the 7 board members showed up. Priscilla later told me 2 others had quietly begun distancing themselves, unwilling to have their names attached to whatever was unraveling, sensing the ground shifting beneath the board's authority. During that sparsely attended meeting, Denise proposed accelerating the pond reclamation timeline, pushing for an emergency vote to finalize common area designation before what she called further legal interference could occur. It read less like community stewardship now and more like a woman racing a clock only she could see. Priscilla, according to her later account, was the lone voice of dissent in that room, asking directly whether the board had received legal counsel confirming the HOA's authority over deeded pre-subdivision parcels. Denise reportedly snapped, "I am the legal counsel this community needs," a comment 3 separate board members would later repeat under oath. That comment, more than anything else, revealed the depth of Denise's overreach, a woman with a real estate license, not a law degree, declaring herself sufficient legal authority to seize deeded private property from 3 separate families, one of them grieving, one of them elderly, one of them simply unwilling to be bullied. Renata, upon hearing about the comment secondhand from Priscilla, actually laughed out loud in her office. "She just handed us a perfect quote," she said. "Arrogance like that doesn't survive a courtroom, Daniel." People like her believe their own performance so completely they forget somebody's always still writing down the script. I began noticing subtler signs the tide was turning beyond the legal filings. Neighbors waving instead of avoiding eye contact. A woman I'd never spoken to leaving. A supportive note in my mailbox. Tom mentioning that even people who'd initially supported the community vision plan were quietly backing away from Denise's group. The HOA's management company, growing uneasy about liability exposure from an increasingly documented harassment pattern, sent Denise a formal internal memo, later obtained through Priscilla, warning her to cease unilateral enforcement actions against specific residents pending full legal review. Denise reportedly ignored it entirely, doubling down instead. 2 weeks after that warning, a new fine appeared on my account, this one for $800, citing continued unauthorized private use of designated future community water access, a designation that still, legally, did not exist anywhere except inside Denise Bellwether's increasingly desperate imagination and a binder full of unapproved plans. Renata, rather than simply disputing the fine again, suggested a bolder move, requesting a formal HOA financial audit through the county's Community Association Oversight Office, using the unexplained emergency legal assessment charges as grounds. It was a request Denise couldn't easily deflect without drawing even more unwanted scrutiny to her own finances. The audit request became public knowledge within days, and something in the neighborhood's collective mood finally, decisively cracked. Residents who'd stayed quiet for months began posting their own questions publicly, tagging Denise directly, asking why an emergency fund now totaled over $11,000 with no itemized spending report anywhere available. Denise's response: a lengthy defensive post insisting the funds were properly allocated per board discretion, only deepened suspicion rather than easing it, especially once Harold Kim publicly calculated that $11,000 in legal defense funding had produced exactly 0 actual attorney invoices anyone in the community had ever seen. I stayed mostly quiet during this public unraveling, letting the community's own scrutiny do work my legal team hadn't needed to force. Renata called it letting the fire find its own oxygen, advising me to keep documenting rather than commenting publicly, preserving my credibility as the calm, wronged party rather than an aggressor. Grace Okafor, emboldened by the shifting mood, finally spoke publicly for the first time, posting a short, dignified message about her husband's memory being disturbed by an unauthorized contractor, without naming Denise directly, though everyone reading it understood exactly who and what she meant, and the post spread rapidly. The Whitfield's daughter, visiting from out of state, also posted on the community page, describing how her elderly parents had received threatening drainage notices identical to Grace's, adding a photo of their own 1971 deed for good measure. 3 separate families, 3 matching stories, suddenly visible to the entire neighborhood at once. Denise's support within the board itself began visibly crumbling. One member resigned outright, citing personal reasons, though Priscilla confided he'd told her privately he didn't want his name near what he now suspected was outright fraud. Another simply stopped responding to Denise's calls and texts entirely, according to Carol at the management office. Still, Denise refused to retreat, perhaps unable to, given how publicly and personally she'd staked her reputation, her real estate listings, and possibly her family's old unfinished ambitions on this single, crumbling claim. Instead, she leaned harder, scheduling an emergency vote she framed as a final community decision on pond access. I received formal notice of the meeting, this time by certified mail addressed correctly to me by name rather than the vague property owner language of earlier letters, as though Denise finally understood exactly who she was fighting and intended to make her final stand directly against me. Personally, publicly. Renata reviewed the notice carefully. Noting a procedural flaw, the emergency vote bypassed the standard 14-day notice period required by the HOA's own bylaws for property-related resolutions. "She's rushing," Renata said. "Rushing means desperation. Desperation means mistakes. We let her make this one, and we use it, rather than immediately challenge the procedural flaw." Renata suggested we let the meeting proceed as scheduled, attending with everything we'd gathered ready to, present publicly for the first time, rather than quietly filing a dry legal objection that most residents would never actually see or understand the significance of. "This needs to happen in front of everyone," Renata said. "Not in a courtroom people never hear about. In that clubhouse, in front of the people she's been manipulating for a year." Rachel, listening nearby, nodded slowly. "Let her build the stage," Rachel said. "You're the one who gets to use it." The days before that meeting passed in careful preparation, organizing documents chronologically, printing enlarged copies of the 1962 deed and county records, coordinating quietly with Grace, the Whitfields, Priscilla, Tom, and even Gerald Finch, who agreed, after much hesitation, to attend in person and speak if necessary. 3 days before the scheduled vote, Denise crossed a line that finally erased any remaining ambiguity about her intentions. Rachel found our mailbox door pried open, its lock bent, contents scattered across the lawn. Not stolen, just violated, as though someone wanted us to know they could reach us whenever they wanted. The following morning, our home security camera caught a delivery drone-style device hovering low over our backyard pond for nearly 10 minutes, clearly conducting some kind of survey or photography, before drifting away toward the direction of Denise's house 2 streets over, its operator never visible on camera. I filed another police report, And this time the responding officer, Sergeant Willis, seemed genuinely alarmed by the escalating pattern laid out chronologically in my growing folder. "This isn't neighbor squabbling anymore," he said.
Mailbox tampering is a federal offense if it's determined.
Renata immediately incorporated the mailbox incident and drone footage into our filings. Noting the timing 3 days before a vote Denise desperately needed to win, suggested consciousness of a weakening position rather than confidence in a strong one. "Innocent people don't escalate like this," she said. "Guilty. Cornered people do." Grace Okafor's situation grew frightening as well. Her cameras, installed only weeks earlier, captured a vehicle idling near her driveway late at night, headlights off, for nearly 20 minutes before pulling away. She couldn't identify the driver, but the license plate, when run by police, traced back to a rental frequently used by local real estate agents for client showings. The Whitfields reported something stranger still. A courtesy inspection notice claiming their pond required emergency environmental testing for public safety, despite no such authority existing anywhere in HOA covenants for private, non-common parcels. Their daughter, furious, forwarded the notice directly to Renata, who added it to the mounting evidence file. It became increasingly clear Denise was no longer operating with any real strategic patience. Throwing escalating tactics at 3 separate families simultaneously, as though sensing her original plan crumbling and hoping sheer aggressive momentum might force at least one family to surrender before the community vote arrived and stripped her authority entirely. Priscilla warned me privately that Denise had begun making strange comments during private board calls, referencing finishing what should have been finished decades ago, and not letting stubborn old families win twice. The remarks, increasingly personal and increasingly untethered from any actual community benefit, alarmed even board members still loyal to her. One night, unable to sleep, I sat by the pond alone, watching moonlight ripple across the surface my grandfather had once fished from. The surface Grace's husband's ashes now rested within. The surface an elderly couple had watched sunsets over for over 50 years. It never felt more worth protecting than in that quiet moment. Rachel joined me outside, wrapping a blanket around both our shoulders. "You know this ends soon, right?" she said. "One way or another." I nodded, though I didn't fully believe it yet. Desperation, I'd learned over these strange months, rarely burns out quietly. It usually burns hottest right before it finally collapses. 2 days before the vote, a certified letter arrived at my house, not from the HOA, but from a private attorney claiming to represent Whispering Pines community interests, threatening a lawsuit against me personally for obstruction of community development and defamatory statements regarding board leadership, seeking damages of $50,000. Renata reviewed it and nearly laughed. "This isn't a real cause of action," she said. "This is intimidation dressed up as litigation, timed specifically to scare you into silence before Thursday's vote." She drafted an immediate response, copying the County Bar Association given the letter's unusually aggressive, unsubstantiated language. It turned out the attorney listed was a solo practitioner with no property law background whatsoever. Someone Denise had apparently found through a listing service, paid personally rather than through HOA funds according to later financial disclosures, revealing just how far she was willing to go using her own resources to silence me. Rachel, reading the threatening letter over my shoulder, finally allowed herself a small, grim smile. "She's not fighting from strength anymore," she said. She's fighting from panic. People with real power don't need to threaten strangers with fake lawsuits 3 days before a vote they claim they're going to win easily. Gerald Finch called that same evening, his voice steadier than during our diner meeting weeks earlier. "I want to speak Thursday," he said. "I've carried this 30 years. I'm not carrying it into my grave too." I thanked him, genuinely moved, understanding what it cost a private, guilt-ridden man to step forward publicly. Grace Okafor and the Whitfield's daughter both confirmed they'd attend as well, each bringing certified copies of their own deeds, prepared to speak if the meeting allowed public comment, which by HOA bylaw, Renata confirmed, it legally had to, regardless of how badly Denise might want to control the proceedings. The night before the vote, I barely slept, running through every document, every date, every twist of the past several months in my head like a film reel. Around midnight, Rachel found me still awake at the dining table, folders spread out like a battle map. "You're ready," she said simply.
You've been ready.
The morning of the meeting, an unexpected email arrived from Priscilla, forwarded from an internal HOA account she technically still had access to, Denise's own draft meeting agenda, revealing she planned to open by preemptively banning outside legal counsel and non-board speakers from addressing the pond resolution at all. Renata immediately drafted a formal objection citing the HOA's own bylaws guaranteeing resident comment periods on any property-related vote, ready to invoke it publicly the moment Denise attempted to shut down discussion. "She's trying to control the room before the room even fills," Renata said.
We just need to be loud.
By 6:30 that evening, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed, cars lining both sides of the street outside, more residents than I'd ever seen at a single HOA function. Word had clearly spread far beyond the usual crowd, pulled in by rumor, curiosity, or the community page's slow-burning weeks of public unraveling. Inside, folding chairs filled every available space, extra rows added at the last minute, residents standing along the back wall when seating ran out entirely. Denise stood at the podium, blazer sharp as always, though something in her posture read tighter, more rigid, than the confident ease she'd carried in earlier months. She opened by attempting exactly what Priscilla had warned about, announcing that, due to legal sensitivities, public comment would be limited strictly to board members tonight. A wave of audible frustration rippled through the crowd before Renata, standing near the front, calmly cited the exact bylaw section guaranteeing resident comment rights. Denise hesitated, glancing toward her remaining loyal board members, none of whom offered any support. Priscilla, sitting on the dais, finally spoke up publicly for the first time. "The bylaws are clear, Denise. We can't legally deny comment on a property resolution." The room's murmurs turned into something closer to open tension. Denise's composure cracked visibly now, a flush spreading across her neck as she reluctantly opened the floor. "Fine," she said, voice tight. "Brief comments only." It was, unmistakably, the sound of someone watching careful control slip through her fingers in real time, in front of the largest audience she'd ever addressed. I stood first, walking to the small microphone set up near the front rows, folder in hand, heart steady despite months of accumulated tension finally reaching this single, crowded room. "My name is Daniel Cross," I began. "And I want to show you all something my grandfather signed in 1962. I held up the certified deed copy, projected simultaneously onto the clubhouse screen through a laptop Renata had connected earlier. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the document's date became clear. Decades before Whispering Pines Estates existed as anything other than open farmland. Long before any HOA covenant could possibly apply. This pond was never common area, I continued. It was never part of this subdivision's platting. County records confirm it. I have certified copies for anyone who wants to see them tonight. I passed printed packets down the rows, watching neighbors flip through pages, watching confusion shift steadily into something closer to anger. Grace Okafor spoke next, her voice trembling but clear, describing her husband's ashes, the contractor who nearly drained the pond without her consent, the note left on her porch. The room fell utterly silent as she spoke. Several residents visibly moved, a few wiping their eyes as she described her fear. The Whitfield's daughter followed, holding up her parents' 1971 deed, describing the false drainage notices, her elderly father's confusion and distress at nearly signing away land his family had owned for 50 years. "My parents deserve peace," she said.
Not intimidation dressed up.
Then Gerald Finch stood, introducing himself as a former accountant for Walt Bellwether's original development company. The room's energy shifted palpably at the Bellwether name. He described the 1998 attempt to seize the same parcels, the forged paperwork that never cleared the county, the family's lingering resentment over the failed scheme. "I typed those memos myself," Gerald said, voice shaking slightly. "I've carried guilt about it for almost 30 years. When I heard a Bellwether was running this HOA, going after the same families, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore." He held up copies of the old internal memos for the room to see. Denise's face had gone pale. Her earlier composure entirely dissolved. "This is completely irrelevant character assassination," she said sharply, though her voice cracked on the final word. "None of this changes tonight's vote." But the room's mood had already shifted decisively, murmurs turning into open, audible disbelief and anger. Priscilla Lang, still seated on the dais, finally spoke the words that would end up quoted in every account of that night. "I have documents showing Denise requested title searches on these exact 3 parcels 8 months before publicly mentioning any pond project," she said. "This was planned, not spontaneous." She held up the printed title search request, date circled in red, passing copies to the other board members seated beside her. One board member, visibly shocked, asked aloud, "Denise, is this true?" Denise didn't answer immediately, her silence stretching long enough to become its own damning confession in front of everyone. "I was simply being thorough," she finally said, though her voice had lost all its earlier confident polish. "Good leadership requires research." Harold Kim, standing near the back, called out, "Research for a plan you hadn't told anyone about yet? That's not leadership, Denise. That's a scheme." The room's temperature seemed to rise with every passing minute. Residents no longer merely watching but actively participating, calling out questions, demanding explanations for the $11,000 emergency legal fund nobody could account for, demanding to know why 3 vulnerable families had been specifically, quietly targeted for nearly a year. Denise attempted to regain control, banging a small gavel against the podium. "This is not the appropriate venue for personal accusations," she said, Though the irony of a woman who'd spent months making personal accusations against 3 families seemed lost on absolutely no one still listening in that crowded room. Renata stood then, introducing herself formally as legal counsel representing the 3 affected families, and calmly informed the board that a formal complaint had already been filed with the county's Community Association Oversight Office, alongside a harassment report, citing surveillance footage, threatening notices, and unauthorized contractor dispatches. This vote cannot legally proceed tonight, Renata continued evenly. Not only do the underlying parcels fall outside HOA jurisdiction per certified county records, but tonight's meeting itself violates your own bylaw's mandatory 14-day notice period for property resolutions. I'd advise the board to table this immediately, for your own protection. A visible wave of relief passed through several board members at Renata's words, as though they'd been searching for permission to abandon a sinking position they'd never fully understood they were standing on. One member immediately moved to table the resolution indefinitely. Another seconded before Denise could even respond. Denise stood frozen at the podium for a long moment, the vote to table passing with only her own dissent, 6-1, her carefully built authority collapsing in real time in front of the largest, most engaged audience Whispering Pines Estates had ever assembled for a single community meeting. "This isn't over," Denise said quietly into the microphone, though the words carried none of their earlier menace, sounding instead like the final, brittle claim of someone who already sensed, deep down, that it very much was. She gathered her binder and left through the side door without another word. The room erupted into overlapping conversation the moment the side door clicked shut, residents turning to each other in shock, relief, and no small amount of anger at having unknowingly funded, through mysterious assessments, a scheme most of them had never actually understood or consented to in any meaningful way. Grace Okafor found me afterward, embracing me tightly despite having met me properly only weeks earlier. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. Gerald Finch shook my hand for a long moment, something unburdened visible in his tired eyes for the first time since I'd met him at that diner. Driving home that night, Rachel reached across the console and squeezed my hand. "You did it," she said. "It's not fully over," I replied, thinking of Denise's parting words. The surveillance footage, the mailbox tampering, the unresolved fines still technically sitting unpaid on my account despite tonight's dramatic public reversal. Renata warned me the following morning that tabling a vote wasn't the same as legal resolution, and that Denise, humiliated publicly, might either retreat entirely or, more dangerously, escalate one final time out of pure desperation before whatever remained of her authority evaporated completely under mounting community and legal scrutiny. That warning proved prescient within days. The County Oversight Office, having received Renata's formal complaint weeks earlier, opened an official investigation into HOA financial mismanagement and potential fraud, requesting full records of the Emergency Legal Assessment Fund, board meeting minutes, and Denise's real estate listings referencing future waterfront access. Simultaneously, the police department's cybercrime unit, working from Sergeant Willis's escalating file, subpoenaed records for the drone footage's registered operator, and traced the idling rental vehicle near Grace's home back to an agency Denise had personally used twice that same month. According to their own booking records, word of the investigation spread through the neighborhood within days, and Denise's remaining public support evaporated almost entirely. Her Facebook group, once actively moderated in her favor, was quietly taken over by Priscilla and two other board members, who posted a formal statement distancing the board from Denise's unilateral actions. An emergency board session, called this time without Denise's involvement entirely, voted unanimously to suspend her presidential authority pending the outcome of the county investigation, appointing Priscilla as interim president, a swift and decisive move that would have seemed unthinkable to the same board just months earlier. Denise, according to Carol at the management office, called repeatedly demanding reinstatement, insisting the suspension was illegal without a full community vote, though Renata confirmed the board's own bylaws explicitly permitted emergency suspension of any officer under active investigation for potential fraud or misconduct, precisely the situation Denise now found herself in. 3 days later, county investigators formally requested my full documentation folder, along with matching files from Grace and the Whitfields, cross-referencing everything against Denise's own board records, real estate listings, and the $11,000 fund that had, according to preliminary findings, no legitimate attorney invoices attached to it whatsoever. Gerald Finch voluntarily gave a formal statement to investigators as well, providing the original Walt Bellwether memos as evidence of a documented, decades-old pattern rather than an isolated incident, strengthening what Renata called a compelling case for intentional, premeditated fraud rather than simple administrative overreach or misunderstanding. I spent those tense days trying to return some normalcy to my family's life, taking my kids fishing at the pond again for the first time in weeks without the shadow of surveillance cameras or contested ownership hanging over the water. My daughter caught a small bluegill and declared, proudly, "This pond is ours." "Yes, it is," I told her, and for the first time in months, I fully believed it myself, the weight of certified deeds and county records finally settling into something that felt less like defensive paperwork and more like simple, undeniable, restored truth about the land my grandfather had left our family. Rachel began sleeping better, no longer startled by every passing car outside our window. The bent fence had been repaired, new cameras installed properly around the entire property perimeter, not out of ongoing fear now, but out of the reasonable caution any family might keep after such a strange, unsettling season. The county investigation moved faster than Renata had expected, aided significantly by the sheer volume of documentation the affected families and Priscilla had already assembled independently. Within 2 weeks, investigators confirmed what we'd suspected for months. The emergency legal fund had partially financed the fake attorney's intimidation letter against me. Bank records subpoenaed from the HOA's account showed a direct transfer to the solo practitioner who'd sent the $50,000 defamation threat, disguised in HOA ledgers as administrative legal consultation, a clear misuse of community funds for what investigators now openly termed personal harassment rather than legitimate association business. Additional records revealed Denise had also used a portion of the fund to pay for the drone footage service that had hovered over my backyard, booked under a private videography company that, when contacted by investigators, confirmed Denise had specifically requested aerial documentation of disputed water parcels for her own personal use. The mailbox tampering, initially difficult to conclusively attribute, finally connected to Denise through an unexpected source, a delivery driver's dashcam footage, subpoenaed from a nearby package company, capturing a vehicle matching Denise's own registered car parked near our mailbox at the exact timestamp of the reported tampering. Faced with mounting, increasingly specific evidence, Denise's own attorney, a real one this time, reportedly advised her strongly against any further public statements, a piece of advice she apparently ignored entirely when a local reporter, following up on the earlier blog coverage, managed to reach her for comment. Her quoted response, printed in the follow-up article, read almost unbelievably tone-deaf given the circumstances. I only ever wanted what was best for this community's future value. The quote spread rapidly through the neighborhood group, drawing more ridicule and anger than sympathy from residents who'd funded her vision unknowingly for months. Renata told me the county's findings, combined with the criminal referrals for mailbox tampering, unauthorized surveillance, and fraudulent misuse of association funds, would likely result in formal charges, separate entirely from the civil property matter, which itself was now essentially settled given the certified deeds nobody could seriously dispute anymore. The bombshell finally landed on a Tuesday morning, when county investigators, executing a search related to the fund misuse case, uncovered something even Renata hadn't anticipated. Evidence Denise had attempted to alter digital plat records held by a private surveying firm she'd personally hired months earlier. The surveying firm's owner, cooperating fully once contacted by investigators, revealed Denise had requested a corrected boundary survey explicitly instructing him to redraw the pond parcels as falling within HOA common area lines, providing him with what she claimed were updated deed references that, upon verification, simply did not exist anywhere in county records. The surveyor, uneasy from the start according to his own statement, had quietly kept his original correspondence with Denise, including her explicit written instructions to adjust the boundary interpretation to reflect community ownership regardless of older filings, a request he'd refused to complete once he recognized its clear fraudulent intent. That refusal, turned out, explained the mysterious orange survey flag that had appeared at my dock months earlier. Not a completed fraudulent survey, but an abandoned attempt. Evidence the surveyor preserved precisely because something about Denise's request had struck him as deeply, professionally wrong from the very beginning. Investigators now had, in a single afternoon, direct written evidence of Denise knowingly attempting to falsify official property boundary records, a felony offense in North Carolina, layered atop existing findings of fund misuse, unauthorized surveillance, and harassment, transforming what began as a paperwork dispute into a genuine criminal case. News of the surveying firm's cooperation spread through the county faster than anything before it, picked up now by a larger regional outlet rather than just the local blog.
The headline finally naming Denise directly. HOA president accused.
Denise's attorney reportedly advised her to stop attending any further HOA-related events entirely, a suggestion she seemed to finally, belatedly heed, absent from the next scheduled board meeting where Priscilla, still serving as interim president, formally announced the county's findings to a packed, stunned clubhouse audience. The board voted unanimously that night to permanently remove Denise from any HOA position, initiate legal action to recover misused community funds, and formally, publicly acknowledge the three families' deeded ownership of their respective ponds, apologizing on behalf of the association for months of harassment conducted under its letterhead. Grace Okafor, present in the audience, was invited to the podium by Priscilla and received a standing ovation from the very same room that, months earlier, had voted 7-2 to strip her of her private, grief-anchored pond. She simply nodded, tears in her eyes, and said, "Thank you for finally listening." The Whitfields, too frail to attend in person, sent their daughter with a short written statement Priscilla read aloud, thanking neighbors who'd spoken up and expressing quiet relief that their 50 years of ownership no longer hung under threat from procedural fines and fabricated drainage notices. I stood when Priscilla gestured toward me, though I found I had little left to say that hadn't already been said in that same room weeks earlier. "I just wanted to keep what my family built," I said simply. I'm glad the truth was strong enough, eventually, to stand on its own. Applause followed, warmer and more genuine than anything Denise had ever received during her tenure. And for the first time in months, walking out of that clubhouse felt less like leaving a battlefield and more like leaving a place that, however imperfectly, had finally corrected itself under its own weight. The criminal case moved forward over the following weeks, with county prosecutors formally charging Denise with attempted falsification of official records, misappropriation of association funds, and harassment. The mailbox tampering charge added separately once postal inspectors confirmed the dashcam footage met their own evidentiary standards. Renata told me the civil side of the case, meanwhile, had essentially resolved itself with certified deeds, county confirmation, and now criminal findings all aligning. There was simply no remaining legal basis for any HOA claim over the three families' properties. A rare case where justice arrived through multiple converging channels rather than one. Denise's real estate license came under separate review by the state licensing board once the fraudulent listings referencing future waterfront access surfaced publicly.
Another consequence rippling outward from a scheme that had, in the end, unraveled almost entirely from its own accumulated weight rather than any single decisive blow.
I sometimes thought about Walt Bellwether during those weeks, an old man I'd never met, whose failed scheme 30 years earlier had somehow found its way, through marriage and inherited grievance, into his nephew's wife's hands, finally completing its collapse 2 generations later in front of a packed community clubhouse. Gerald Finch called one evening, his voice noticeably lighter than during our first uneasy diner meeting. "I slept through the night for the first time in years," he told me. "Guilt's a strange thing to carry that long. I'm just glad it finally landed somewhere it could actually do some good." Priscilla, settling comfortably into her interim role, initiated a full bylaw review to prevent future officers from unilaterally imposing fines or assessments without documented board consensus, a reform several residents credited directly to watching how easily one determined dishonest person had nearly exploited unchecked procedural authority for personal gain. The neighborhood itself seemed to exhale collectively over those weeks. The private Facebook group returning to mundane posts about lost cats and yard sales rather than tense accusations and vague threats. Tom Alvarez joked that Whispering Pines hadn't felt this boring, in the best possible way, in over a year. Rachel and I finally repainted our own dock. The faded community property sign Denise's crew had once painted their long since removed, replaced with nothing at all, just weathered wood and clear water, exactly as it had looked before any of this began, exactly as my grandfather had left it decades earlier. My daughter asked one evening, watching the sunset ripple gold across the pond, why the mean HOA lady had wanted our pond so badly in the first place. I considered how to explain greed and inherited grudges to an 8-year-old, and finally just said, "Some people forget that some things aren't for sale." Grace Okafor visited us that same week, bringing a small potted plant to replace the dead one left threateningly on her own porch months earlier. She planted it near my dock instead, saying she wanted something good to grow from all of it. Something neither of us had asked for but both had survived. As the criminal case proceeded toward what Renata expected would eventually be a plea agreement given the overwhelming documentary evidence, Denise largely vanished from public neighborhood life entirely. Her house eventually listed for sale by a different agent. The waterfront potential language conspicuously, permanently absent from its description. I felt, surprisingly, less triumphant than I'd expected watching that for sale sign go up 2 streets over. Mostly I just felt tired and grateful and ready to return to the ordinary rhythms of a life I'd never actually wanted to spend defending in the first place. Just quietly, stubbornly determined to keep. The final HOA meeting I attended that season felt almost unremarkable by comparison to everything before it. Routine budget discussion, landscaping schedules, a brief thank you extended to the residents who'd helped uncover months of hidden misconduct. Priscilla closed simply, saying, "Let's just be a normal neighborhood again." Somewhere in that ordinary, unremarkable meeting, I realized the fight had actually ended, not with a dramatic final confrontation, but with the slow, steady return of boredom. The quiet privilege of an HOA meeting being about mulch prices instead of stolen ponds and forged surveys and grieving widows' disturbed memorials. Months later, Denise pleaded guilty to reduced charges covering fund misappropriation and attempted record falsification, receiving probation, mandatory restitution to the HOA, and a permanent bar from serving in any community association leadership role within the state. Quiet, procedural ending to a scheme that had once felt unstoppable. The harassment and mailbox tampering charges, handled separately, resulted in additional supervised probation. Renata explained, the overall outcome falling short of jail time but more than sufficient. In Grace's words, to make sure she remembers exactly why nobody trusted her word again in that neighborhood. I never spoke to Denise directly again after that final chaotic clubhouse meeting. Our paths simply stopped crossing entirely once her house sold and she moved away. From Whispering Pines for good. The loud, confident woman with the laminated binder fading quietly into something closer to a cautionary story neighbors told newcomers. Restitution funds, once finally recovered, were used by the board, under Priscilla's continued leadership, to formally document and publicly record all deeded private parcels within the community's boundaries, ensuring no future officer could ever again claim confusion, genuine or manufactured, over which properties actually belonged to the association. Grace Okafor's health, strained by months of stress, slowly improved once the threat finally lifted entirely. Her doctor later telling her, half joking, that resolved lawsuits apparently made for excellent medicine. She still tends her small planted memorial by my dock every spring. The water calm around it now. The Whitfields, deeply relieved, celebrated their 52nd wedding anniversary that autumn beside their own restored pond. Their daughter later telling me it was the first birthday in nearly a year her parents had actually seemed like themselves again, rather than 2 frightened elderly people bracing for the next unsettling notice. Gerald Finch, in an unexpected final gesture, donated the old Bellwether Company memos to the County Historical Archive, saying he wanted the record preserved honestly rather than buried in guilt any longer. A small, symbolic act of finally setting down a weight he'd carried silently for 3 decades. Tom Alvarez still jokes occasionally about the Great Pond War, though always gently, always with the easy humor of someone who watched a genuine injustice get corrected rather than someone who'd merely enjoyed neighborhood drama for its own sake. He remains, to this day, the first person who ever truly believed me. Priscilla Lang was elected HOA president outright the following spring. Running unopposed, her platform built explicitly on transparency, documented consensus, and what she called, smiling slightly during her acceptance speech, boring, predictable, well-recorded community governance, a phrase the entire room, myself included, applauded warmly and without irony. Rachel and I hosted a small gathering by the pond that summer, inviting Grace, the Whitfields, Tom, Priscilla, and Gerald, an unlikely coalition of neighbors bound together by a fight none of them had chosen but all of them had ultimately survived. My daughter caught another bluegill and declared it, proudly, personal record, watching everyone laugh together in the fading evening light. I thought about how close this pond had come to becoming just another line item in someone else's inflated real estate listing, its history erased, its meaning flattened into waterfront amenity, language stripped of everything that actually made it worth protecting. My grandfather never met Rachel, never met my children, never could have imagined the strange legal battle his simple 1962 deed would one day anchor. But sitting there that evening, watching my daughter skip stones across water he once fished himself, I felt him present in every ripple, every quiet, heart-won moment. Renata, stopping by briefly that evening on her way home from another case, raised a glass of lemonade toward the pond. To boring paperwork, she said, only half joking. That turns out to matter more than anyone ever expects it to. We all laughed, clinking glasses, grateful for something that simple, that true. I think often now about how easily this could have gone differently, if my grandfather hadn't kept his deed carefully filed, if Gerald Finch had stayed silent forever, if Priscilla had chosen board loyalty over conscience, if Grace or the Whitfields had simply been too tired or too scared to keep fighting. Justice, I learned, rarely arrives as a single dramatic thunderclap. It arrives slowly, built from small, stubborn acts, a filed folder, a shared photograph, a whispered warning passed between neighbors who barely knew each other before a shared threat quietly, steadily brought them together against something none of them should have had to face alone. Denise Bellwether, I later heard through distant neighborhood grapevine, moved to another state entirely, though whether she carries any real understanding of what she nearly destroyed, or simply views it as an unlucky scheme that finally failed after 2 family generations of trying, I suppose I'll never actually know for certain. What I do know is this: the pond behind my house still holds its quiet, unremarkable magic exactly as it always did, untouched by binders, unclaimed by anyone's inflated resale fantasy. Simply mine, simply ours, simply a small piece of water my family was fortunate, and stubborn, and lucky enough to keep. Some nights, long after the kids are asleep and Rachel has gone up to bed, I still walk down to the dock alone, just to sit for a while, listening to frogs and distant traffic, remembering how close an ordinary Tuesday evening once came to permanently, quietly changing under someone else's ambitious pen. It didn't change. In the end, it stayed exactly what it always was: a small, private, unremarkable pond, holding a family's memories, a widow's grief, an elderly couple's decades of shared sunsets, and one stubborn engineer's quiet, patient refusal to let a laminated binder decide what belonged to whom. I keep the old folder still, thick with certified deeds, meeting minutes, surveillance footage stills, and Gerald's old memos, tucked back into that same fireproof box in the garage where my grandfather's original 1962 deed once sat forgotten for decades before it suddenly, urgently, mattered more than anything else in my life. Maybe someday my own children will find that folder the way I found their great-grandfather's deed, tucked away and half forgotten until some future, unimaginable moment makes it matter again. I hope, honestly, that they never need it. But I'm glad, deeply glad, that it will simply be there, waiting, just in case, because that, in the end, is what this entire strange, exhausting season taught me, that quiet, careful documentation, patient allies, and a stubborn refusal to be pressured into surrendering something rightfully yours can outlast even the most confident, most calculated, most relentlessly ambitious attempt to simply take it away. Denise Bellwether believed, for a long time, that persistence alone would eventually wear 3 tired, ordinary families down. She was wrong. For a filing cabinet in a garage, a guilt-ridden accountant's old memos, a young board member's conscience, or a pond that refused, quietly, to stop being ours. In the weeks that followed the plea agreement, our neighborhood settled into something I hadn't realized I'd missed: so deeply, genuine, unremarkable normalcy. Barbecues resumed without tension. Meetings ended on time. Nobody circled anyone's property on a projected slide labeled underutilized community assets ever again. Priscilla's transparency reforms passed unanimously the following year, requiring itemized public disclosure for any assessment above $200, and mandatory board consensus, documented in writing, before any fine could be issued against an individual homeowner. Small procedural safeguards born directly from watching how badly their absence had once been exploited. Grace Okafor, the Whitfields, and our family remained close afterward, bound by something deeper than mere neighborly proximity, a shared understanding of what it costs to protect something quietly precious against someone determined, for their own reasons, to take it. We still gather by the pond most summer evenings. Rachel says sometimes that the pond feels different now, not because anything physically changed, but because we finally, fully understand exactly what it took to keep it. I think she's right. Extraordinary the moment you're forced to actually fight to hold on to them. I don't know what became of Denise's family legacy, whether some future Bellwether might someday try again, drawn by old resentment or renewed ambition toward the same small parcels of water. But I know the deed still sits safely filed, the county records still stand certified, and the truth, this time, held, that, I've come to believe, is the only real ending any of us truly get in stories like this. Not perfect vindication, not dramatic revenge, but simply the quiet, hard-won relief of keeping what was rightfully yours, and watching a community slowly, imperfectly, learn to do better because of what it nearly lost. My daughter still fishes off that dock most weekends, my son learning to skip stones beside her, both of them blissfully unaware of how close this ordinary, sunlit water once came to becoming somebody else's inflated listing photo. I intend, quietly, to keep it that way for as long as I possibly can. Some evenings, watching them laugh by the water's edge. I think of my grandfather signing that faded 1962 deed, never imagining it would one day sit projected on a clubhouse screen, silencing a room, ending a scheme, and protecting a legacy he could never have predicted would need protecting so many decades later. The pond remains exactly what it always was: quiet, private, and entirely, undeniably ours, held together not by a laminated binder or a manufactured community vision, but by one old deed, 3 stubborn families, and a truth that no amount of ambition, however calculated, could ever successfully paint over.